she wept through her wedding until the cowboy promised, "One day you'll smile again." Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind howled across the Montana Territory in 1878 as if the earth itself meant to test the resolve of the people standing in the small wooden chapel. Dust swirled around the weathered windows, rattling the glass panes, and the preacher's voice struggled to rise above the storm. Inside Eliza, Marin stood stiff in her plain dress, tears streaking her face. Each word of the vows felt like a stone pressing heavier against her chest. Her brother had arranged this marriage without her consent, selling her future to cover his mounting debts. Beside her stood James Calder, a tall cattleman with sun-browned skin shoulders broad from years of hard work and calloused hands resting quietly on the brim of his hat. His face bore the mark of long winters and summers spent under unforgiving skies, lines etched deep not from leisure, but from endurance. Eliza dared not meet his gaze at first. She'd spoken to him only twice before this day. Once when her brother announced their fate, and once when she begged James not to go through with it. Both times he had said little, just a slow nod, his steady eyes giving away nothing. Now, as the preacher droned on about duty and unity, Eliza's sobs caught in her throat. She felt trapped, bound in a bargain that left her no room to breathe. Her brother sat in the front pew arms, folded jaw set, like a man who had already moved past his sister's misery. He would walk away lighter that evening, his pockets lined with the security James's land and cattle promised. Eliza wanted to vanish into the swirling wind outside, but there was no door she could run through without shame marking her forever. Then, just as the preacher called for her vows, James leaned ever so slightly toward her. His voice was low, a whisper meant only for her ears close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. "I'll make you smile some day," he murmured. The words struck her like a spark in the cold. She blinked up at him, startled, her breath hitching. James wasn't handsome in the polished way of the men she remembered from Boston streets. No fine coats, no slick hair, no gentleman's charm. But his eyes, gray as river stone, were steady, unyielding, and in that moment strangely kind. For the first time all day, she felt the weight of her grief ease, if only slightly. The vows concluded. A ring of silver circled her trembling finger. She barely remembered the preacher's final blessing or the murmured congratulations that followed. Her brother barely glanced back at her as he shook James's hand with something too close to relief. When the crowd dispersed, James offered his arm, and though Eliza hesitated, she placed her hand there. It felt foreign, strange, yet secure. Together, they walked into the storm. Outside, the wagon waited. James guided her up with quiet strength, then took the reins. The two of them rode in silence, the sound of hooves muffled in the rolling wind. Eliza clutched her shawl tighter around her, watching the endless horizon stretch in every direction. She felt swallowed by the immensity of the land, miles of open plains and hills dotted with stubborn pines. Beside her, James handled the reins with calm certainty, as though he had no fear of the wilderness swallowing them whole. By sundown, the wagon crested a low hill, and James drew the horses to a halt in front of a modest homestead. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the outline of a lean-to stable stood against the falling dusk. The cabin looked small against the wild sweep of the valley, but it was solid with walls squared by careful labor. As Eliza's eyes scanned the unfamiliar place that was now her home, the door opened. An older woman stepped outside, sturdy in build, her graying hair tied back beneath a faded kerchief. A rifle rested across her shoulder like it belonged there as naturally as an apron. Her eyes flicked over Eliza, not cruel but sharp, weighing her like one might weigh weather signs in the sky. "This her?" she asked James, her tone more practical than welcoming. "This is Eliza," James replied. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Martha, she helped raise me after my folks passed." Martha nodded once, setting the rifle aside. "We've got stew inside. Come eat." Eliza followed them into the warmth of the cabin. The scent of pine rabbit and wood smoke wrapped around her, reminding her how empty her stomach felt. She sat stiffly in a corner, while James hung his coat by the door and Martha ladled steaming stew into bowls. When the bowl was placed before her, Eliza hesitated, hands trembling as she lifted the spoon. Martha's eyes softened just a little. "Eat," she said simply. "You look like a wind gust could carry you off." Eliza ate not out of hunger alone, but because the act steadied her. Across the table, James ate quietly, slow and deliberate, his gaze drifting toward her without making it obvious. When she rose to set her empty bowl near the basin, her hand shook so badly the spoon clattered against the wood. Martha reached out her grip, firm but kind, steadying Eliza's hands. "You didn't choose this," Martha said softly. "But James is a good man. He won't hurt you." The words nearly unraveled her, but she only nodded throat-tight, unable to answer. That night, James lit a small oil lamp in the front room, the glow softening the rough-hewn timbers. He pointed toward the narrow bed against the wall. "I'll take the chair," he said, setting his hat aside. His voice held no expectation, no demand, only quiet certainty. Eliza's heart thudded. She gave a grateful nod, though shame pressed against her chest for feeling so relieved. James paused, his hand resting on the back of the chair. "You're safe here," he added. The words lingered in the still air long after the lamp dimmed. Eliza lay awake that night, staring at the low rafters, the smell of pine smoke and wool filling her senses. She still felt the weight of the ring on her finger, but James's whisper from earlier echoed in her mind, "I'll make you smile someday." For the first time since the vows, she wondered if perhaps her life, though not chosen, might not be entirely lost. The days that followed moved like winter molasses, slow, heavy, unchanging. Each morning, Eliza Marin rose with the pale light seeping through the cabin's small window. The air inside carried the lingering scent of smoke and pine sap, and though the quilt around her shoulders gave some warmth, the chill never fully left her bones. She swept the wooden floor, fetched water from the well, and tried to busy her hands with mending linens. The work gave her purpose, though her heart still felt adrift. James Calder moved with the rhythm of the land. At first light, he was gone, riding out to check the cattle or mend a stretch of fence. Dust and frost clung to his coat by the time he returned. In the evening, his face weathered but steady. He spoke little, though not from indifference. His silence carried patience rather than neglect. Each night, Eliza found herself watching him across the table as Martha dished out supper, wondering what kind of man carried both strength and restraint in such quiet measure. It was in the smallest gestures that James revealed himself. On the third morning, Eliza discovered a cluster of wildflowers in a jar on the table, tiny yellow blooms fragile against the rough wood. She didn't ask who placed them there. She knew. Another day, she found a folded scrap of paper near the hearth. James's handwriting, careful though, uneven wagon, needs fixing, but I'll take you into town soon. He left these tokens without seeking acknowledgement, as though offering her a choice to notice or not. Slowly, piece by piece, something within her softened. Then, one bitter morning, Martha shook Eliza awake with urgency in her voice. "Come quick," she said, her lined face etched with worry. Eliza hurried outside, clutching her shawl against the sharp wind. By the fence, James knelt in the snow beside two children, a girl of 6 or 7 shivering in a torn dress, and a boy, a few years older, standing protectively behind her. Their hair was tangled shoes worn through cheeks hollow with hunger. "Found them by the creek," James said quietly. His voice was steady, though his eyes carried something heavier. No adults, just the two of them. Eliza's heart clenched. She knelt, trying to catch the girl's gaze. "What are your names?" "Sarah," the girl whispered, her voice thin as thread. "This is my brother Luke." Eliza swallowed hard, reaching gently for Sarah's hand. Her fingers were icy. Together, she and Martha ushered the children into the warmth of the cabin. They bathed them, wrapped them in spare clothes, and filled bowls with stew until the children's trembling eased. Sarah clung to Eliza, her small frame pressed close, as though afraid she might vanish if she let go. Luke sat stiff but alert eyes, flicking toward James with cautious trust. That evening, as the sun dipped low and snow began to fall, the children curled beneath a quilt by the fire. Eliza stood on the porch, arms folded, staring at the hills that seemed to stretch without end. "Where are their parents?" she asked, her voice low. James joined her, his hat pulled down against the wind. Wagon overturned downstream. Empty. No tracks but theirs. He paused, his jaw tightening. "Looks like they were abandoned." Eliza felt her chest tighten, a memory rushing back, her own mother gone too soon. Her father swallowed by the bottle, her brother trading her future for a stack of cattle receipts. The old ache of being left behind rose sharp in her throat. She turned to James, eyes fierce. "They can stay right." James looked at her, then really looked. For a long moment, the silence between them spoke louder than words. Finally, he nodded. Of course, the days that followed were different. Eliza found herself brushing Sarah's hair each morning, humming faint lullabies she hadn't dared sing in years. The girl leaned into her touch, her small shoulders loosening as the weeks passed. Luke shadowed James everywhere, mending saddles, learning how to mend a fence, eager to prove himself useful. James guided him patiently, correcting him with a calm hand and the kind of steady presence a boy longed for. Eliza noticed the faintest flicker of a smile cross James's face when Luke managed to throw a rope just right. It was Sarah, though, who broke the ice around Eliza's heart. One evening, after supper, the little girl clambered onto Eliza's lap without asking. Eliza froze at first, unsure what to do with the sudden weight of trust against her. Then Sarah nestled in close, her lashes fluttering shut. "You smell like cinnamon," the girl mumbled sleepily, already half gone to dreams. Eliza looked up startled, only to find James watching her from across the room. His eyes were warm, steady, carrying something unspoken that reached deeper than any vow spoken in a chapel. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Winter deepened, snow laying its claim on the valley. Each day demanded work to keep the hearth burning and the cattle fed, but in that rhythm, Eliza found something she hadn't known. She missed a sense of belonging. When she rose in the morning, Sarah's small hand often found hers. Luke carried wood without complaint, his young shoulders already learning responsibility. James returned from the fields with dusted snow in his hair, and each night his quiet presence filled the cabin, not with silence, but with steadiness. For the first time since her wedding day, Eliza realized she no longer cried when the sun set. The promise James whispered, "I'll make you smile someday," still echoed in her mind, but now surrounded by the warmth of children's laughter and the unyielding strength of the man who had given her more freedom than she expected. She wondered if that day might be closer than she once believed. Winter pressed down with its full weight, the valley wrapped in a quilt of ice and silence. Snow buried the cabin steps, and frost crawled across the windows until the world outside looked like it had been carved from glass. Inside, the small family held close to the fire each day, a test of endurance. Yet, within that hardship, something began to shift. James Calder rose before dawn to tend the cattle, his figure often just a shadow moving against the white blur of storm. Luke trudged after him more often, now his eager stride slowed by the cold, but his determination steady. Eliza found herself watching them from the window, pride sneaking into her chest. The boy who had first clung to his sister now carried himself taller, his eyes sharper with purpose. Sarah stayed by Eliza's side most mornings, small hands clutching scraps of fabric as Eliza mended shirts or patched quilts. Sometimes Sarah hummed under her breath, tuneless sweet, the sound of a child who finally felt safe enough to make noise. Eliza caught herself humming too, almost without realizing it. The sound startled her as though she had stumbled upon a piece of herself she thought lost. When storms broke and the wind quieted, James would ride into town for supplies. On one such trip, he returned with a traveling doctor whose wagon wheels had nearly sunk in the slush. The man examined the children by firelight, his spectacles fogged at the edges. "They're strong," he said after listening to Sarah's lungs and checking Luke's stiff arm. "The girl's cough will fade. The boy's arm won't straighten all the way, but it won't keep him from work." Eliza's shoulders eased. She had carried worry like an iron weight, and hearing the words felt like air finally breaking through. James stood nearby, silent but alert, his gaze fixed on the children as though their well-being mattered more than his own. That night, when the doctor left with bread and blankets tucked into his wagon, Eliza lingered by the hearth. James sat across from her, a book open in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in some time. The firelight cast his face in warm shadows lines, softened his presence steady. "I used to sing," Eliza said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words came anyway. "Back when my mother was alive, she'd hum while she worked and I'd follow her tune. But after she died, I didn't have the heart for it. I don't even remember her voice anymore, just the shape of it like a room I used to know." James closed the book gently. "You could sing again," he said, his voice low but sure. "No one would stop you here." Eliza looked at him, her throat tight. She didn't answer, but after a long pause she let a faint hum slip from her chest. The sound was almost more breath than tune, but James didn't move, didn't interrupt. He only listened, and somehow that felt enough. Days later, James asked her to ride with him to the river bend, a place he claimed offered quiet when the noise of life grew too heavy. They saddled the mule, and though the air bit at their cheeks, they went. The river lay hushed beneath a skin of ice, its edges whispering against the current. Eliza sat on a flat stone boots rooted to the frozen ground, while James stood a few paces back, watching her with quiet patience. "You come here when you need silence," she said, her gaze on the water. "It's the only place that ever felt like mine," he admitted, lowering himself to sit beside her. After a long pause, he added, "My father used to say, 'Water remembers. Grief sinks, deep joy floats on top, but both run together.'" Eliza let the words wash over her. "I used to believe sorrow had to be carried, that letting it go meant you stopped loving what you lost." She turned her face toward the pale sun breaking through the clouds. Now I think maybe sorrow only asks to be seen, not held. A crow called from the trees above, breaking the silence. James reached into his coat and pulled a willow branch and knife, stripping the bark with slow, deliberate strokes. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice lighter. "Fishing line holder. Luke's been asking to learn." Eliza watched his hands work. He's grown so much these past weeks. He watches everything, learns fast. Her lips curved faintly, like someone else I know. He didn't look up. "You mean me?" Her laugh escaped before she could stop it, real sudden, unforced. It startled her so much that she pressed her hand to her mouth as if she'd spoken out of turn. James stopped carving and met her eyes. His gaze warmed with quiet triumph. "That's twice now," he said softly. What she asked, half defensive, half shy. "You've smiled, maybe even meant it." Heat rose to her cheeks, but she didn't deny it. When they returned to the cabin, Sarah ran out to meet them, her braid bouncing against her back. "There's a letter," she announced breathlessly. "Martha says it's for you." Eliza frowned, taking the envelope. Her name was scrawled in a hand she recognized all too well. Inside, her brother's words cut sharp across the page. He was leaving Westbrook and desperate, asking her to return and help him start over. Eliza folded the paper slowly and set it on the mantel. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm not going back." Martha glanced at her from the stove and gave a small nod. "Didn't think you would." That night, Eliza lay awake, not with sorrow, but with a strange certainty filling her chest. The path she had not chosen had begun to shape into something else, something she wanted. For the first time since her wedding vows, she realized she was no longer bound by survival alone. She was building something new, something her brother's debts could never touch. And when she closed her eyes, she heard James's whisper again. "I'll make you smile someday." Only this time she believed him. The thaw came suddenly, as if the land had grown weary of holding its breath. Snow receded in uneven patches, leaving the valley streaked with mud and rivulets of meltwater that glittered under a pale spring sun. The earth smelled different, damp, alive, and for the first time in months, Eliza heard birdsong threading through the air outside the cabin. With spring came neighbors. A wagon rolled up one morning, drawn by a pair of sturdy bays coated in sawdust. Two men climbed down, both broad-shouldered, the older one tipping his hat politely. "Calder," he said. "We're raising a barn up by Alder Creek. Could use an extra team and a steady hand. Thought you might be interested." James listened, his expression unreadable. "How long?" "Week, maybe 2, the younger man answered. "You'd be home by sundown." James's eyes flicked to Eliza. She could read the hesitation in the set of his shoulders, his sense of responsibility for the homestead, the children, the life they were carving together. She didn't pause. "Take the offer," she said firmly. He looked at her uncertain. "You've given more than your share to this place," she added. "Let it give something back." Her words carried weight, and James finally nodded. The men tipped their hats, promising to fetch him at dawn the next day. For Eliza, the following weeks became a trial and a revelation. James was gone from dawn until dusk, his absence stretching across the hours like a shadow. Yet, instead of collapsing under the weight of responsibility, she discovered strength she hadn't realized she held. Sarah clung to her, at first frightened by James's absence. Eliza took her into the south field, showing her where the frost had receded and where the earth had loosened enough to turn. Together, they pressed seeds into the soil, Sarah's small fingers covering them with care. "They'll grow," Eliza said, and though she meant the plants, she knew the words carried further. Luke, under Martha's watchful eye, learned to set traps near the creek. Each evening he returned with shoulders straighter, his voice steadier as he reported what he'd caught. Martha, sharp-tongued but kind beneath it all, muttered about boys and splinters but taught him to gut a rabbit cleanly, her rifle never far from reach. The cabin fell into a new rhythm. Eliza cooked more than before, filling the rooms with the rich scent of stew and pepper, the kind of warmth that made Sarah giggle and Luke linger longer at the table. At night, Luke read aloud by lamplight, his words halting but growing more confident. Sarah often fell asleep against Eliza's side, her small breaths soft against her arm. Each time Eliza tucked the quilt around her, she felt the deep, steady pulse of something she'd never known, family. On the 6th day, the creak of wagon wheels returned earlier than expected. Eliza and the children hurried to the porch to find James stepping down his coat, damp with sweat and eyes tired but bright. He looked older somehow, as though the weight of labor and the satisfaction of completion had carved new lines of certainty into him. "You're early," Eliza said, her voice betraying both surprise and relief. "Finished ahead of schedule," James replied. He paused, meeting her eyes with quiet honesty. Wanted to get back before dark. In his hand, he carried a folded paper. At the table, he spreaded out a contract offering him a stake in the lumber partnership. They said I could take on the West Quarter if I put up a share come spring. Would mean less time out with the cattle, more time here. Eliza studied his face. He wasn't a man who dreamed aloud often. The fact that he placed this decision before her meant something deeper than the words on the page. Slowly, she folded the contract and set it on the mantel. "Then we'll find a way." Later that evening, as Martha retired early with a headache and the children dozed by the fire, Eliza found herself alone in the kitchen with James. The lamplight painted the room in gold, the scent of stew still lingering. She dried her hands on a cloth, then leaned against the counter. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked. James looked up from the basin where he was rinsing his hands. "I did, years back. Thought I'd head south, see the desert lands. But something always held me here. Obligation." He shook his head. "No, just didn't want to go without someone to come back to." The words sank into her chest, quiet but certain. She swallowed. "I used to dream of cities, places where no one knew my name, where I could walk a market street and not carry anyone's burden but my own. Still want that?" She shook her head. "Not anymore. I just want a place where the days are steady, where no one raises their voice." James stepped closer, slow but sure. "You have that here." Her hand moved almost without thought, brushing the edge of his shirt sleeve. "I know." His hand found hers, warm, firm, steady. For a long while, they stood there, the only sound, the faint shift of logs in the fire. That night, when Eliza rose to take her quilt into the front room, James stopped her with a look. His eyes asked a question he didn't voice. Eliza answered by staying. She lay down beside him beneath the worn wool blanket, his arm resting across her back, not claiming, not demanding, simply there. The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear, but full of promise. The next morning, Eliza saddled the mule herself. She packed a small satchel with bread and dried apples, then stepped into the bedroom where James was pulling on his boots. "I'm going to the river bend," she said softly. "Thought maybe you'd come." He didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply picked up his coat and followed her out into the light. By the river's edge, the water whispered beneath a thin crust of ice. Eliza sat on a flat stone skirts tucked beneath her knees, the pale sun brushing her hair. James lowered himself beside her. For a long while they said nothing, Then, quietly, she turned toward him. "I don't cry when I wake any more," she said. "That's how I know." His hand found hers, rough fingers closing around her smaller ones. He bent his head and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, an act that spoke more than any vow. Her breath caught, but not from sorrow. Something new had risen in its place, something solid and sure. For the first time since the day of her wedding, Eliza felt she was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning to live. Spring unfolded with a vigor that felt almost defiant after the long, suffocating winter. Patches of green pressed through the thawing ground, timid at first, but bolder as the days grew warmer. The cabin, once a place of survival, now stirred with the hum of creation. Eliza could feel it in the rhythm of their lives, the steady thud of Luke's boots as he ran out to check the traps. The sweet sound of Sarah's laughter as she spun in circles beneath the budding cottonwood, the low creak of James's saw as he worked fresh boards into place. It was James who set the tone, bringing out a small cedar box one Sunday morning. The air smelled faintly of earth and wood smoke as he laid it on the table. Inside, nestled on a scrap of cloth, lay a silver ring etched with a delicate pine bough. His rough hands held it carefully as though it were more fragile than glass. "I didn't ask," before he said, his voice low but steady. "But I'm asking now if you want to wear it." Eliza's breath caught. The memory of that chapel, her tears, the weight of a ring forced upon her, all of it pressed for a moment against her chest. But this was different. This was choice. She reached out both hands, trembling slightly, and slipped the ring onto her finger. Her eyes shone, but no tears came. She managed a small smile. James's lips curved faintly, and he reached across the table, covering her hand with his. No words were needed. That summer, they built an addition to the cabin. James and Luke raised beams with sweat and steady hands, while Sarah and Eliza painted the door a bright red. Sarah insisted on stringing dried orange peel from the rafters to keep the spiders out, and Eliza led her laughing softly at the child's certainty. The smell of citrus mixed with sawdust and clay, a fragrance that spoke of new beginnings. In the evenings, Eliza began teaching Sarah her letters by lamplight. Soon, children from nearby farms joined them, curious and eager. What began as a quiet effort grew into a small school. In the front room of the cabin, Eliza's voice weaving knowledge through the simple songs her mother once hummed. The cabin filled with laughter, with voices repeating sounds and syllables with the warmth of possibility. Time, relentless yet generous, moved forward. Martha's health waned, her sharpness softening as her body grew tired. One winter evening, she passed quietly, her quilt pulled up to her chin, Eliza reading aloud while James stood silently at the door. They buried her beneath the cottonwood, the earth cold and firm, Sarah planting lupine around the stone with hands too small yet determined. "She'll have flowers," the girl whispered, and Eliza's chest ached with both grief and pride. Years slipped by, not in haste, but in fullness. Luke grew tall and sure, his hands steady on the reins as he took over the cattle himself. Sarah stitched her first dress at 12, stubbornly wearing it every day until the seams nearly frayed. James accepted his share in the lumber partnership, half-days spent at the mill, sawdust in his hair and stories in his pocket. Eliza found contentment not in the life she once imagined, but in the life she had built: the school, the garden, the steady circle of home. One evening, long after the first frost, James and Eliza sat on the porch with mugs of coffee warm in their hands. The stars blinked sharp and bright above the ridge, the air still but full of quiet. James's voice broke the silence, low and thoughtful. "You remember when I said I'd make you smile someday?" Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, her lips curving. I remember everything. The words settled between them like an oath fulfilled. They stayed there until the fire inside burned low, until the night folded close and warm around them. The wind moved through the grass, not with fury but with ease, like it had nowhere else to be. Eliza thought of that chapel years ago, the tears, the fear, the weight of a life she hadn't chosen. And then she thought of this porch, the red door, the children's laughter, the warmth of James's hand steady on hers. What she had been given was not what she expected, but it was more than she had dared to hope for. A home, Eliza realized, was not built by walls or rings, nor by bargains struck in desperation. It was built in the quiet, patient choices repeated day after day, the hand extended without demand, the meal shared without question, the promise kept without fanfare. James had made her smile, not with grand gestures, but with the steadiness of love lived out in small, ordinary acts. To those listening to their story, perhaps the lesson lies here: the life worth building isn't always the one we choose at first, but the one we choose to nurture when the chance arrives. Strength is not in holding on to grief, but in letting it be seen and allowing joy to rise beside it. If you've ever found love in an unexpected place, or if you've built something lasting from broken beginnings, share your story in the comments below. And if this tale touched, you don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience, quiet courage, and the kind of love that endures.